So hello everybody and welcome back. So I hope everyone managed to take a bit of time out, or maybe even use the platform to do some more networking during the break we've had, or look at the exhibition stands. Actually, that's one thing I haven't mentioned yet, the exhibition area. So so if you haven't yet done so, maybe not now because we're about to have a session starting, but after this session, please feel free to go and browse the exhibition area that we have on the platform. Again, you can access that through the menu bar on the left-hand side. So please do that if you haven't done already. But as I said, not now, because we have our next session just about to start. So so following the first session, which obviously looked at where we are with 5G rollout in the region, we're now moving on to look at something that's obviously very topical at the moment: managing spectrum in times of crisis. So looking at the response from industry and from connectivity providers on how the work that's been done to try and keep networks live and keep societies connected. So we're looking forward to a session, and we have an excellent lineup of speakers with us to discuss those issues. So I'd now like to welcome to the stage our moderator for the second session, Scott Minahan. Scott, welcome. And
thanks, Sam.
Welcome, hi there. And yeah, really looking forward to the session, and I'll pass over to you to start the discussion and introduce our speakers. So over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Well, good evening, everyone from Australia, and good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Very pleased to chair this evening's session on looking at some of the telecommunications in a crisis. The COVID situation, the pandemic, is obviously having a big impact globally, and it's pretty close to my heart, given that Melbourne's currently in a lockdown. It will be for the next 6 weeks, but also because we were very pleased to help the ITU work up a paper looking at some of the pandemic and some of the COVID issues. So that looked at a whole range of things, from the emergency responses from industry, which I think have been generally very, very good, except for those who actually don't have service, and we'll talk about that later, about the digital divide. Then to talk about the recovery phase, and then on to talking about some of the new normal that we're going to have to face in the telecoms industry. And so the link will be up, and I think Dan will put that up in the comments for you. For the panel today, though, what we've got is, and it was very pleasing to see the early session, but there's a lot of questions. But what we've got is a panel of 4 distinguished speakers, and to give you a quick rundown on them, first up, and introduce them, and then we'll go into give them all about 5 minutes each, and then we'll have hopefully a very good interactive session. The first speaker will be Ian Fogg. He is VP of Analysis at OpenSignal. I think many of you will know OpenSignal. He and his team develop industry-leading insights and analysis of what's happening in the mobile industry, and certainly I'm a constant user of his material, and I'd certainly recommend it to you if you haven't seen it. The second speaker will be Johan Smit, who is joining us from South Africa. He's an executive of international and spectrum regulations at Telkom. I've known Johan for a number of years, and I think you'll find a very great and very insightful perspective on spectrum issues. He has been in the industry for more than 30 years and over 25 years in spectrum management. And some of the lessons that I think from South Africa during this COVID period will be, I think, very interesting to an Asia Pacific audience. He's also very famous because I believe he was one of the key drivers of bringing the 700 megahertz to Africa. The third speaker is Atihola Mani from ISOA and the satellite industry. She's been Secretary General of ISOA since 2004, and under her leadership, ISOA and the CEOs of the member satellite companies have really done a tremendous job in looking at satellite comms. And we often don't think enough about some of the satellite connectivity that's been provided during this COVID period, but I'm sure that she will be a very strong advocate for what they do and some of the benefits that they provided. And lastly, but certainly not least, Maritza Delgado, who is the Program Officer from the ITU, focusing on the Environment and Emergency Telecommunications Division. She's responsible for assisting countries in the context of emergency telecoms, and clearly COVID fits within that, and I think she will give a very good perspective from the ITU, and having worked with them with the Reg for COVID platform, I think you'll find it incredibly useful. So let me hand over to Ian Fogg for his 5 minutes, and welcome, Ian, and the audience is awaiting your words of wisdom, sir.
Great, thank you for the kind introduction. So at OpenSignal, we collect data on the real-world experience of mobile users around the world. We collect that from smartphone users. So we can see as the crisis has evolved, we've seen changes in behavior. In some cases, we've seen that change even before lockdown measures went into place. One of the measures we looked at first was the amount of time that smartphone users spend on Wi-Fi. Normally that's higher on weekends and on public holidays. And we saw that spike up in a range of countries during the crisis. We saw it go up first in Hong Kong back in the end of January, which you'd normally expect in Hong Kong at that time because it was Chinese New Year. But it stayed up right the way through February, March. And then during March, we saw time on Wi-Fi spike up at a range of countries across Asia, not just Hong Kong, but across Asia, but also in Europe and in the Americas as well, as people basically spent more time at home. We also have tracked the impact on the cellular experience. And in many countries, we've seen drops in download speed during the crisis. Many reasons for that. It depends on the country, what's happened, and how resilient the networks have been. In some countries, people have spent time in different parts of the country where maybe the infrastructure deployed is not used to having as much usage during daytime. People are spending more time in residential areas. In other places, we've seen free data given out by operators. We saw that in Italy. We've seen big measures, I think, across Malaysia like that too. And that's obviously increased data usage on the cellular network too. So although the speeds may have dropped a little bit, they're still very good, they're still very resilient, and it's because people are using the networks much more. When we've looked at data consumption overall, we've seen interesting patterns. We've seen some users, many users in most countries spending less data, using less data, and a minority of users using a lot more. And how that's evolved really depends on how widespread fixed broadband is in a country and how many mobile-only households there are. We've seen some quite big differences. The challenge here, of course, from a spectrum perspective is it's very hard to add a lot of additional capacity very quickly, whether it's additional backhaul to the cell towers, whether it's additional spectrum. And so higher data consumption and different patterns of data consumption, more video perhaps, can affect the mobile experience. So this has been a great case study of what happens when you don't have enough spectrum and people are using the network more. We have seen a few examples globally where there have been temporary spectrum loans. In the US, we analyzed what happened on T-Mobile, where they acquired significantly large amounts of more spectrum. They had an average of about 10 megahertz on the 600 megahertz band pre-crisis. In March, they acquired temporary loans, and their average spectrum allocation on that band went up to about 25 megahertz, which is a hell of a lot for a low band like that. And we saw the speeds on that band rise from about 10 megabit up to around about 20 megabits about a month later as that spectrum came into place. And then more recently, we've seen those spectrum loans expire and we've seen the experience change again. So I think what we look at in this crisis is it's really highlighted the importance of adequate capacity, and it's highlighted the importance of mobile as a way of connecting people. Obviously, when you look at capacity side, one of the big angles is what was talked about earlier on today, which is 5G, because 5G will run on 3 to 6 gigahertz spectrum bands, obviously the C band, as well as millimeter wave, which you can't put 4G on or 3G or 2G. So it adds a lot more capacity because those are higher frequency bands with much wider channel widths. When we look across Asia, I think this highlights the importance of freeing up that band, that C band, in parts of Asia where it's been tricky. There hasn't been that much available because of additional users. And we've seen similar things in the Americas where that band's also quite problematic. I think what this has also highlighted is the real world experience can change very quickly in a crisis like this. And having an ongoing flow of data from real users, looking at not just the technical characteristics of their experience, like download speed or signal strength, but also what's happening with the video experience. People are streaming more. How does that change during the crisis too? Because what we often see is we see operators maybe throttle or prioritize or deprioritize video traffic because it's such a large part of their data usage in order to offer good download speeds. But of course, from a user perspective, they really want to do all of that. They want great download speeds, but they want a great video experience. They don't want to make that trade-off. At OpenSignal, we actually test video streaming separately. So we can see the effects of that kind of network traffic management on the video experience of users. So that's, I think, a really important thing looking ahead. But the capacity piece, I think, will not go away. We're going to see change patterns, I think, for the long term. People who've adopted video conferencing sessions like this and have got used to it, I think will continue to change and use those applications and services even when we have a vaccine and things go back to normal. I think the potential for wireless to offer fixed experiences, household experiences in areas where there's not fixed wired broadband coverage, that's going to become even more important in many countries across Southeast Asia. So there's all sorts of things here which I think are critical. The data points I've mentioned, by the way, on this 5-minute kind of intro, we all have published on our website. I'll share them on the chat via on the event organizer as well. But if not, just have a look on our website and you can click on the Market Insights link and see a number of analyses we've done on COVID impacts. The T-Mobile one I mentioned, we did an analysis on India, we've done one on the US. We've done a kind of global comparison of how speeds and time and Wi-Fi have changed. And you can see some of those different cycles of what's happening in different countries. I mean, as we know, Australia is currently in lockdown. Europe is in a much better place at the moment. So it kind of, and we can see that in our data, how those different cycles are varying during the crisis.
Thanks very much, Ian. Very, very insightful, giving us a global perspective. And I think a lot of people will be interested in the US and what's happening in various aspects. And as I said, I'm sure the link will be provided, but OpenSignal has a vast treasure trove of quality material and quantitative material that's very helpful, I think, to regulators and operators around the region. If I can now move to Johan Smit from Telkom and to give a South African perspective. And as I said, there have been very few countries who have allocated temporary spectrum, and South Africa is one of them. A huge amount of spectrum, maybe or arguably because of the failures of allocating enough spectrum, in the previous decade. But I won't steal his thunder, and I'll pass over to you, Johan.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Yeah, that was the ideal starting point. I think it's important just to understand the context in South Africa. We have been planning for the awarding of additional spectrum, specifically the sub-1 gig spectrum, the 2600 and 3500 bands since about 2006. So it's long overdue. It so happened that this year seems to be the year that the spectrum will be auctioned. This process started off last year when our minister published policies and policy directions regarding the licensing of high demand spectrum, as well as the licensing of a wireless open access network that will provide wholesale services only. Then ICASA followed with their draft ITA that we called an information memorandum November last year, and they asked for inputs on that. And that closed on 31st of January this year. They received in excess of 50 submissions on that. So we could see that the interest in licensing of more spectrum as well as the wireless open access network is quite huge. In that process, what ICASA is proposing is a substantial amount of spectrum that will be made available. The entire 700 megahertz, the entire 800 megahertz, 2300 megahertz. ICASA is of the view that there's about 40 megahertz left there. Almost the entire 2600 band, as well as a big chunk in 3500 spectrum. And so we expect the invitation to apply probably this month. And then the auctioning is scheduled for later this year, December, and probably the licensing of that spectrum early next year. So just then go back, then what happened in March, as everybody is well aware of, the national state of the disaster was also declared in South Africa. That was declared on the 15th of March, and it started on the midnight of 27th of March. And then actually in South Africa, things moved very, very rapidly. The COVID-19 regulations were published. The Minister of ICTs, or the Telecoms Minister, published directions pertaining to the postal services, telecom services, and broadcasting services on 26th of March, actually the day before the lockdown started. And those directions addressed various issues associated with COVID-19. The most important one pertinent to this discussion is, of course, the licensing of on-demand, high-demand spectrum. This spectrum that is planned to be auctioned later this year, that is then to be licensed on a temporary basis. But the directions also dealt with other issues like individual track and trace support, automatic type approval procedures, and then importantly also telcos, those that get spectrum, must zero rate all access to educational and health websites. And so that process is still ongoing, and new sites are added on a weekly basis. And then there was also a prohibition on price increases, as well as mobile number portability. Then soon after the directions, less than 2 weeks thereafter, ICASA actually came out with their ICT regulations. And they gave some incentives to operators, one being that annual spectrum fees, which were payable 31st of March, was extended to the 30th of June. So we got some relief there in terms of paying for the spectrum. Then it was also the application process of all the spectrum that they put in the information memorandum. So a substantial amount of spectrum. So it was 2x30 in 700, 2x30 in 800, 40 megahertz in 2300, 170 megahertz TDD spectrum in 2600, as well as 116 megahertz in 3500. And then also they allowed TV white spaces to operate in the UHF band from 470 to 694. Then, importantly also, because of the other obligations, the spectrum, this temporary spectrum, was awarded free of charge. So there's no fees payable for the use of the spectrum during the COVID-19 period. The applications was due on the 9th of April, and 20 April and 24 April, ICASA awarded the licenses to the 5 winning licensees, the incumbent operators. So since the declaration of the state of disaster until the licensing of the temporary spectrum, things really moved very quickly. Just to give a brief overview of the network of Telkom, and we did, as part of our application process to ICASA, because you had to show to the regulator that you can really make use of the spectrum expeditiously. We gave the regulator stats in terms of the network the week before lockdown and then the week after lockdown. And I'm just going to give you a few numbers. But if we look at, for example, the air interface resource congestion that we experienced, depending on what frequency band we looked at, being 1800 or 2100 or 2300, that increased between 113% and 166% in 1 week. And so the average traffic volume increased about 35% in a matter of a week or two. So there was a huge demand on the network. Fortunately for Telkom, we could deploy some immediate measures because we have a big chunk of spectrum in 2300, so we could deploy additional LTE carriers in the 2300. We have 85 megahertz of spectrum available in that band. We could also, most operators double up on their fiber speeds for free, so that brought some relief to networks as well. And then we immediately started with the planning of the 2600 and the 3500 spectrum as well. I'm not going to go into the detail, but all of that available spectrum was assigned to the three incumbent, well, to Vodacom, MTN, and Telkom. Cell C, that used to be number 3 in the market, they did actually not apply for any additional spectrum, but then there was also some spectrum awarded to Liquid and Rain, the two smaller operators in the country. And yeah, I think let me stop there. I'm sure we will have another opportunity to expand a little bit on that. Oh yeah, and then lastly, just to mention that 3 licenses were issued to TV whitespace operators to operate in the UHF broadcasting band as well. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, Johan. And I think a very fast process compared with the earlier very slow allocation process. And I think, obviously some of the traffic numbers that you're mentioning, a number of the mobile and other connectivity providers would be feeling that as well over this period. And the other thing that really surprised me about the presentation, or seeing how much temporary spectrum was allocated in South Africa, is that I think the total temporary spectrum that you've had allocated is actually higher than the total INT spectrum allocated in many Asia-Pacific markets. And I think if that's one lesson from this process, is that in the new normal, we do need to allocate more spectrum for these types of wireless broadband and fixed wireless access type services. Let me move a change of pace from the mobile industry and wireless fixed wireless access to the satellite industry, and hand over to Artie for her insightful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. I'm delighted to participate in this session for the satellite sector. In our sector, we've seen some really interesting trends during the crisis. There are use cases across business, domestic, government, and NGO sectors, and that too both on land and at sea. Because many of those who are stuck at home are actually also stuck at sea, because crews of cargo ships, for example, are not allowed to disembark from vessels that are transporting essential goods from port to port. But if we think of the domestic land user, then I would share a few observations that we have made. The first thing is that direct satellite broadband connectivity is on the rise. Members who are in that business providing direct satellite broadband have seen up to a 70% increase in data traffic on their connections and a hike in new subscriptions. So direct satellite broadband relies on Ka band because of the higher capacity it provides, and users are receiving anywhere from 15 to 20 megabit per second up to 100 megabit per second download speeds. I spoke to one operator who told me that if he had 3 satellites right now, he could fill them all. Secondly, mobile operators are requesting more capacity for backhaul to meet the demands of users working from home, which is often outside urban areas. These examples are using Ka, Ku, and C-band capacity. Now, I think this observation is really important. Whether people are stuck at home or working from home, the point is that rural connectivity is fundamentally important. We all know that, and the digital divide with nearly 50% of the world's unconnected is nothing new. But it's now, with the pandemic, where even developed countries are feeling the need to connect their rural communities, that we're seeing the demand for satellite backhaul surging. It should happen anyway for the world's 50% unconnected, but it's now that we're seeing the surge, which I think is an interesting observation. Thirdly, countries have learned the lesson. They have been the ones who have been best prepared. Japan is a great example for this. The Japanese had a clear reason to start thinking about reliability in their networks after the 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and the overheating of its Fukushima nuclear power station. A lot more satellite was embedded into their networks since then, and during lockdown, Intelsat, which provides 3G, 4G backhaul for SoftBank, saw a 100% increase in rural-only traffic. And in Japan, they actually provide the entire end-to-end solution there. Fourthly, satellite broadcasting is being used in a new way. Some operators have been requested by their governments to broadcast educational content on dedicated channels to support continuity of learning for children. And this is using both KU and C bands. And I have to say a lot of it is Middle East, Africa, and further east. Next point is that multiple disasters can and do happen at the same time, and we need to be prepared. Maybe Maritza will speak about this, but here in Asia, during the lockdown, Vanuatu suffered Cyclone Harold, and satellite operators were called upon to support the relief efforts. This was at a time when nothing could be flown into the country, but a satellite solution was found using Ka band, which is what they rely on over there. Next point, my semi-last point, is that incident response and command vehicles have relied on satellite during these last few months, even where there is complete 4G coverage. I think this is also interesting. Obviously, there is a need to police the lockdown and ensure people are complying. And we know that command vehicles relied 24/7 on satellite because they needed to be absolutely sure about the reliability and security of their network, of their service. And they couldn't risk not having communications due to mobile network congestion. The last point I would like to make, and Dan, maybe you could show the slide now, is that the most used application globally during this time over satellite was YouTube, followed by WhatsApp, and then full streaming on Netflix. So I know there's still a large community who likes to go on about satellite being suboptimal because of latency, etc., but maybe this helps. We can see that satellite enabled the same types of applications that we see running over any other broadband platform. So this experience that we're all going through has really highlighted the fact that we need every technology to play its role to get the connectivity job done. If every technology has a role to play, then of course each one also needs access to spectrum, certain access to spectrum. For IMT, I think it's not about identifying more spectrum, but it's about licensing and using what has already been identified for IMT, and there's a lot of it. Satellite spectrum is used all the time, but during a crisis, whether it's a pandemic or a natural disaster, operators have shown that they can reorganize themselves to ensure delivery of critical services alongside the existing ones, so maximizing the efficient use of their spectrum. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Artie, and you're absolutely right. You know, during the pandemic and some of the which is still going on in various parts of the world, you know, every single country is looking for connectivity solutions, and you're right. There is a real need to think about how to maximize what we have during that emergency phase, but then going on to new recovery, obviously everyone's going to need to share that spectrum to make sure that we can come out of the recovery and adapt to the new normal. Just one question I think you're right on, and it's covered off in the ITU paper on the pandemic and COVID responses, is in Asia Pacific, I think only, even though we have a lot of IMT spectrum that's been harmonized, only about 50%, I think this is some work done by LS Telecom, only about 50% of it's actually been allocated. So if you're in a country that hasn't allocated the spectrum, that you've already harmonized, maybe you've gone through WRC 07 or 12 or whatever, and you haven't allocated all of the bands that have already been harmonized, then this is a great opportunity to think about that and work through in a spectrum roadmap how you're going to allocate that spectrum that's already been designated for say, mobile services, and then think about how satellite fits in within that structure. Just the fourth speaker to turn to Maritza from the ITU. Over to you for your introductory comments, please.
Well, thank you very much for giving the opportunity for ITU to participate at this. I am not a spectrum expert, but we use the spectrum. I work in the Emergency Telecommunications Division, and I am part of the team that came together and designed and put up the reg for COVID in ITU. So although ITU is not, let's say, a humanitarian entity and to provide help member states with satellite equipment, but we do help member states in putting all the initiatives together and national plans together in order to for them to be prepared to respond to any disaster or pandemic. I am very focused on disaster coming from natural hazards, but now including pandemics. But this is something new, and we are all learning around the world. So what ITU has done is that we have the Network for Resilience, the BREC for COVID, which is a place for regulators and policymakers and other stakeholders to share information, view what initiatives are going around the world, what measures have been introduced, and discuss and exchange among peers on experiences and ongoing initiatives and innovative and policy regulatory measures designed to help communities remain connected, and not only communities, all end users connected during this crisis, and also to prepare for the medium and long-term recovery. And as part of this team, we have come up with some contingency plan for pandemics. Just let me mention that at ITU, we have launched some guidelines on how to develop national emergency telecommunication plans. And these plans cover all the natural hazards and also pandemics, and gives you a step-by-step process on how to put together a national strategy, including all national stakeholders. Because when we are talking about using ICTs and emergencies, it's not only for the ICT sector or the government. It's a multi-stakeholder approach. And the good thing about these guidelines is that they include and they suggest which entities should work in developing this national initiative. And this is a very good place to come and mention, like, for example, operators, mobile, satellite operators, mentioning that what type of spectrum they need in order to operate. When we talk about the contingency plans, this document specifically focuses on the ICT telecom and outlines a set of actions that countries could take to prepare for, to anticipate, and to be ready to respond, and to ensure network continuity and service delivery for not only this emergency, but for future health emergencies. And knowing that we are now living in a new normal, so this guide really helps at a national level, regulators and all different entities to put together a plan so they can be ready to respond to any disaster. But for these, we need policy decisions, we need decrees, we need regulations for the use of these the telecom infrastructure, and for the services to be delivered at the end users. And of course, we are talking about spectrum, and spectrum is really, really needed when we are talking about these. But spectrum it needs to be put in place in advance. We need to know what spectrum is needed, what are the infrastructure that we are going to use. Let's say we are talking about mobile in the cities where connectivity is very good. But as Artie mentioned already, we need to focus as well in the rural communities. And for us, the rural communities are the most vulnerable. Not only for natural hazards, but also for these pandemics. They don't have any connectivity. And the best way to give connectivity to them and to include that is to deliver satellite connectivity. And we have done this. For example, just an example that we are doing in the Pacific Islands is that we are developing a project to deliver connectivity to the rural areas in different countries. One of them is Vanuatu. And as part of this project, we had delivered some satellite terminals there. And to include, to have telecommunications in the rural places. And why satellite? Because there is very difficult to have mobile services delivered there. So as mentioned by Artie, we had delivered some KU but this is something that we really need to take into consideration when we are talking about vulnerability of countries. Some KU satellite terminals there. But when the emergency came up and we didn't have any other way of delivering other type of equipment there, the good thing is that we came up with some proposals from Pacific that they were going to provide connectivity through these satellite terminals that they had already in place. So pre-positioning equipment is one of the things that we need to consider, and also the licensing and to be able to use this equipment when we are talking about emergency telecommunications. We have also developed some other proposals and to come up with countries to be prepared for that. And spectrum for us is more than relevant. And when we are talking about satellite connectivity, for us is good because the new satellite infrastructure can be delivered to communities, to rural areas very easily, to provide connectivity for them to have early warning alerts and to have a way to be communicated them also with the central entities providing their response. So I leave it with this, the ITU. We have done many other things, but I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thanks, Maurizio. And I think the ITU just does a tremendous job. So thanks for the rundown on what's happening with the ITU in the Pacific. And it's another part of Asia Pacific that we really do need to make sure that we're properly looking after. And let me just emphasize that reg for COVID is absolutely a very good site. And you'll see, I think there's over 400 responses that were delivered to the ITU of some of the things that operators, governments, all stakeholders are actually trying to do to improve the services delivered to customers or consumers or citizens during this pandemic phase. I'm going to move to some questions, and let me first give you just one poll result, and it's not a surprise for anyone in this industry. And we asked the question: do you think that we'll exit this crisis with changed expectations or targets or goals for tackling the digital divide? Only 9% said unchanged, and 91% said there will be some tackling. There'll be increased urgency for addressing the digital divide, and I think that's operators, stakeholders, and certainly governments and political policymakers absolutely understand that these things will need to be accelerated, and we will need to bring people on, in terms of working from home and studying from home and making sure that the digital divide, means that it is addressed more quickly than perhaps we were doing in certain countries doing very well, but I think we need to accelerate that pace. Let me first, before we get some other questions, let me first ask some very short answers from the panel, because we want to get to some of the questions from the people, which hopefully are coming through. Let me ask you, Ian, a quick question just about, can you just talk a little bit about some of the changes in data consumption and what that's meant for quality of service, and what do you think some of the drivers might be, and give an OpenSignal perspective?
Sure. So we've looked at data consumption in a range of countries. We've looked at the overall amount of data consumption, and typically where that's gone up, we've seen the experience slightly decline. In countries where we've seen the overall data consumption flat, we've seen little impact on the experience. And conversely, where we've seen data consumption fall, we've seen the experience in some cases improve. But it's not exactly that straightforward, because we've looked at the distribution of users. And what we see in most countries is the majority of users see average data usage fall, and a minority of users see average data consumption increase. And the net effect in a country depends on the relationship between those different things. So we're seeing different trends, and it's clearly evolving during the crisis. People are clearly using their phones more in many cases, and for different kinds of activities. And we're seeing the location change too, which can have another impact. So there's a lot of things that are all happening at the same time, effectively, and the net effect differs by where you are in the crisis, how bad the lockdown is, and what the quality of the baseline infrastructure is in the country. It's not a very simple thing to look at, but there is clearly a relationship between data consumption and the experience.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me turn to Johan, and I'd like to get a bit of a session of like to draw you out on one particular issue. Some of the Asia Pacific regulators that I spoke to were very concerned about allocating temporary spectrum, because sometimes it's hard to get it back once you've allocated temporary spectrum. Is that one of the lessons that's been learned in South Africa? How do you think that's going to play out? And you know, is it looking like that it will be a process that where that isn't taken into account? What's your perspective on that from South Africa?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Yeah, that is a very, very good question, and that is something that is in the back of all of our minds. I think the fact that we are planning to go into an auction later this year, and if our timing and plan stays on track and there's an auction in December, and with the COVID temporary spectrum coming to an end on the 30th of November, there's a potential that obviously you will not retain all your temporary spectrum through the auction because ICASA have literally assigned everything, and a large portion of that will be set aside for the wireless open access network. But I think it allowed operators the opportunity to obviously to deal with the extra demand for bandwidth during the COVID period, but also it allowed us the opportunity to plan for the deployment of this spectrum that we will probably get end of the year through the auction. For example, one of the challenges that we have in South Africa is that in the 700, 800 bands, we still have broadcasting systems there, and that process has not been completed. So this process have actually allowed us to do some tests and experiments and planning and coordinating. How can we actually coordinate and so that was actually quite good for us. But the fact that the temporary spectrum will come to an end on the 30th of November is still in the back of all our minds, and I think only time will be able to tell us. If there's a delay for whatever reason in the auctioning of the spectrum, then it may become a challenge. But hopefully that process will stay on track, and then there could be some smooth transition from the temporary spectrum to getting some spectrum through the auction process.
Sure. Well, I'm reminded on all this process by, was it the head of the in the US, Fauci, who said it's the virus that decides the timing of this process, not people. So we might end up having a situation where some of those temporary allocations may need to be somewhat extended. Artie, moving over to you. COVID has meant that a lot of people have been stuck at home for some time. How do you think satellites responded? You know, you've had, obviously satellite has a long life once the bird's in the sky. But have the products and the services that have been offered by satellite providers, has that changed? Has there been any differences that you've seen from your industry perspective?
Yeah, so I talked about some of the examples, and I've shared a link on the chat about what the operators have been doing. I think what we notice as a step change is, we've been calling for cross-sector collaboration for a hell of a long time. We've been urging for more use of satellite backhaul, more take-up of satellite broadband, and so on. It's all happening now. It should be happening anyway, but it's happening now. So finally, we see that satellite is less of a lone voice in calling to bridge the digital divide as we felt we were before. And I think the results of one of the polls, which I'm sure you'll come to, kind of resonates very well with that.
Excellent. And I suppose last question to Maritza, just, obviously the ITU's had this role. What do you think is the next thing the ITU could do in this space? The reg for COVID has been done. You're still getting, I imagine, comments. Is there some other elements of the strategy? I was part of a panel last week. Is there more thinking happening about how to take it forward from the ITU perspective? Is there anything you can share, or you have another perspective on some of the things that you're doing in the Pacific that might be that might drive some of the lessons that we could take from this session?
So what we can do from our side is to provide some concrete, in guidelines, because in ITU is guidelines, resolutions. And so we are trying to do is to launch, as mentioned before, the pandemic guidelines that will really help countries to be more prepared and focused on what to do. Because we are learning now in the process, but we need to have something specific written, so everybody can be guided on the specific things and actions that they need to be done. And this cannot be during the response. It should be in the preparedness phase, in the mitigation phase. Mm-hmm. So we need to learn from our lessons. We need to take those lessons learned into consideration and update these plans. And the contingency plan gives you a very good opportunity to have there what is really needed and how are you going to develop these, but also to implement. And the implementation at a national level is what we are doing now in the response phase, implementing that. But everybody needs to be prepared well in advance. It cannot be during the response phase. So what we are proposing is with these guidelines, everybody to know what to do. And we are providing there some recommendations, specific recommendations for each one of the agencies participating in that contingency plan. As mentioned before, it's not only for the ICT sector, including mobile, satellite, but also for the government sector, because the needs of agencies are all different. If we speak about homes, we have some urgent need to have communications, of course, because we are working from home. Our kids are doing school online, but we don't need to. We cannot forget about hospitals. We can because they need broadband connectivity. So that needs to be in the response, in the contingency plan. But this is something that we can have the best plan developed and we can implement it. But we need to ensure that these plans are living documents and that we need to rehearse. And for that also, we have developed some specific guidelines to rehearse, to develop some exercises at least twice a year to see how we are doing in this, if the plan is still there, if we need to, for example, increase more satellite spectrum for a specific entity or a specific region, like if we are talking about the Pacific Islands, if we are talking about the Caribbean islands, they need a specific connectivity, types of connectivity in different regions. Now, let's not forget that we need to have all available technologies in place. It's not only about satellite, it's not only about mobile, but different technologies that can be used in different places. And this also needs to be in the plan. We need to know the plans are going to be tailored down to the specific needs of each country. And specifically to each one of the entities, because this plan can be also used by each one of the entities participating to see what they really need to consider to include there so they can be prepared. So this is what we are doing, and we are going to launch these the pandemic guidelines. So to have something concrete, but these documents should be implemented and should be put in place every time.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a good lesson. We should have prepared more, but I think for a 100-year event, I think it's been a pretty hard lesson for a lot of countries and a lot of stakeholders. I wanted to, before getting my panelists in through some questions that have come in, just to talk about the second poll that we had. And that poll was what has the COVID crisis highlighted the greatest need for in countries across the APAC region? the number one was network coverage. So that obviously a very important thing where there's that gap in Asia Pacific around the digital divide and providing services. The second one was about broadband speed. And then the third one, a joint tie, was about network resilience, which some of the things that Maritza's just been talking about, and also the allocation of additional IMT spectrum. So, and the last one, or the last couple, were machine type communications and low latency. So I think there's some very insightful views that coverage is one of the key country drivers across this process.
I think
sorry,
I was just jump in if that was okay.
Sure.
I think one of the interesting things there is those factors actually tie together. When you think about network coverage now, it's not about having a 2G signal where you can make a phone call. Network coverage now means good enough coverage to have a data experience to use some of the things that we're using on this call today. And that then feeds into some of the discussions around the right spectrum allocations and some of the other factors as well. It all kind of ties together.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, sure. Yeah, Artie.
Sorry, I take issue with that. I think you're right. But we who have the privilege and the experience of being able to do this tend to assume that this is what's required everywhere. And it's not. And it's not. I'm telling you, there is amazing stuff going on, enabling kids to do interactive things and even speak to other kids in different countries on download speeds of between 10 to 15 megabit per second. It works. And when we're talking about enabling connectivity for all in the present climate, we have to acknowledge that and move away from trying to think that everybody needs the kind of connectivity that you need to enable a Zoom call.
I think 10 to 15 megabits, if you have it stably, is enough for a Zoom call. Actually, that's fine. That's actually quite a good connection. If you look in our data across parts of Asia, even in cities, you sometimes have average speeds below 10 to 15. 10 to 15 is actually a pretty good broadband experience.
Just on that, I'm using an ADSL 2+ connection here, and I normally only get 12 to 13 megabits a second. So we're not doing too badly. But look, you're right. It's about having innovative solutions across the divide, right? In markets, having some innovation, allowing that flexibility is part of what we're talking about. I think that's important. And I'm sure that some of the other sessions during the next few days. But I do want to get to some of the questions if we can. And maybe it does go back to Ian, because you're just talking about it. And one of the questions that came in is, how would you rate the overall response from countries and communications providers in Asia to the COVID response? Is there a grouping that you can put together that have done better? Is there people who could, who've done the best? Is there any way you can characterize that?
I think it's very hard to generalize, apart from saying, I think the networks have been pretty resilient, really. I mean, at the start of the crisis, I think people were really concerned that everything would fall over, and it clearly hasn't. In some countries, we've seen operators take preemptive steps to throttle their speeds, and most of them removed those throttles pretty quickly when they realized it wasn't necessary. But overall, the experience has been really resilient. I think that the difference has been just, the nature of the country. It's very hard to compare Indonesia with Hong Kong or India with Thailand. The dynamics of the country, the structure, the distribution of people, the geography is all so different. But I think the theme has been everyone's been under pressure. Everyone's been having to adapt their working practices on the network side. Everyone's had to be living in different ways, and yet, in the main, things have held up pretty well. And in many cases, they've rebounded. If you look at our most recent data, we've seen the experience, return to normal, and in some cases improve.
Yeah, look, I think you're right. And let me congratulate the industry on behalf of the industry. I think generally we've done a pretty good job on addressing this huge surge in demand and this need also for services in hospitals and triage and all the rest of it. Can I just turn over to Johan? One of the questions has come in specifically to the South African temporary licensing experience, and that is, how does the temporary spectrum licensing work for bands when the operators have not yet installed any radios? In other words, how useful are temporary spectrum licenses unless the operators know that they'll become permanent?
Yeah, another good question.
Unfortunately, Johan, we might come back to you in a second if you can hear me.
What we have found is that obviously
he's dropped out. I'm not sure whether it's a fiber connection or a satellite connection, but I don't want to point the fingers. Let me move over and we'll come back to him in a second if he rejoins us. And it's a question to you, Artie. It's like, and it's come from Telkomsat in Indonesia. And that is, at the time of this crisis, what's the most important thing for an operator and a regulator to keep connectivity in their country run well? What do you think the key thing from your perspective is?
You know, where people have satellite connectivity, we saw it worked well. The problem is just how do we stop bridging that divide, and that's where the regulators really come into it. And this goes back to the point where I thought I was taking issue with Ian, but clearly I'm not. It's just that we are seeing a lot of initiatives to write things down now, you know, action plans, guidelines, and so on. And that we must be mindful not to be too prescriptive of speed and latency requirements, because that's where we make assumptions. We assume that the best connectivity, be it fiber, be it whatever, has to be the best for everyone. And for some regions, it's not the best, it's the worst, because it will never, ever reach them. And so if we start, so regulators just need to be mindful of the diversity across nations, across continents, and make regulations and guidance that really enable all solutions to get involved and play a role.
Sure. And look, and I think that's right. You know, having that collaboration in the early phase of the pandemic allowed so many things that had been held back to really move very, very fast. We've got about 3 minutes, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of you in a second, and if Johan comes back, we'll let him answer, but I'd like you to think about a tweet for our session. What's the key little tweet that you would say about this particular thing? And, you know, who would like to go first of my panelists? Who wants to jump in with a tweet thinking about what's the key thing that I would tweet about the COVID response, or, you know, and remembering the spectrum focus here of this particular session. Anyone?
I'll go first if you like.
Yeah, Ian, please.
So I think we've got 240 characters now, I think, so I've got a few more words. So I think it's 240. It's more than 160 anyway. So I would say the mobile experience during COVID has been resilient despite enormous pressure. But we can't rest on our laurels. We need to make sure the capacity is there for future mobile data growth, because now everyone is relying on mobile. Their expectations are going to go up.
I'm not sure that's a tweet, but it's not bad. Maritza.
Okay, great. So I would like to say that speed and efficiency of a response is proportional to the level of preparedness. And the spectrum is key for the use of any type of telecommunication infrastructure to be connected.
Thank you. Artie?
You never told us you're going to ask us tough questions.
Well, sometimes you got to get surprised. It's called dealing with the pandemic, right? This is part of the experience. You got to think on your feet, be collaborative.
I think a tweet would be about get real, be pragmatic, connect your people with whatever you can.
Okay. Johan, have you rejoined us? Perhaps not, and maybe if there's got any particular questions, I'm sure he would answer, you know, privately. I want to thank all the panelists. I've got my own little tweet, and that is the new normal is going to throw up even more problems. So the telecoms industry's got to be prepared for that. And you know, I think that we're only at the really. I had early on thought that. This process was going to be 6 months. I think it's going to be longer. And I think we're going to, as an industry, going to have to deal with that. So thank you very much to my panelists, Ian, Artie, Maritza, and Johan in Africa, who's desperately trying to get more connectivity. And thank you all. And I'll hand back to Dan.
Thank you.
Scott, thank you very much, and I also would like to add my thanks to all of the panelists. So again, a really interesting session. So thank you all so much for that. And yeah, apologies for the slight issues that we had with Johan, but I think he managed to get his points across before we lost him. So yeah, Johan, if you're still hearing, I'm not sure if you can hear us or not, but Johan, thank you very much as well. So. But that's great. As I said, I think that was a really, really interesting panel as well, and to hear about some of the responses that are taking place both in the region and obviously outside the region as well to the crisis. I think it's really useful to do that. So next up, we now move to our showcase sessions. This is the first set of our showcase sessions. So what you need to do now, you actually have a choice of 3 different sessions that are taking place. So all of these sessions are taking place in the stages area. You are currently on the main stage, but if you click back on the stages tab on the left-hand side of your screen, you will see you have options to join one of 3 showcase stages. So the 3 sessions that we now have running, and these are all hosted by some of our partner organizations for the conference. So you have on showcase stage 1, the session is 5G licensing best practice and global case studies hosted by GSMA. On showcase stage 2, we have delivering the requirements of 5G with 6 gigahertz, which is hosted by Coliago. And on showcase stage 3, we have spectrum monitoring of higher frequency ranges, challenges, and solutions, which is hosted by LS Telcom. So 3 really interesting sessions taking place there. So please do make your way over in a second to the one that you would like to participate there. And don't worry at all if you wanted to check out more than one. They are all running in parallel, but they're all being recorded, and we will send links out links out afterwards to all of the sessions, so you will be able to catch on any that you have missed. And then following those showcase sessions, we do have a bit of a break, but please don't forget that we are then back at 7:30 p.m. Indonesia time for the first of what we're calling our after hours session. So back here again at 7:30 p.m., as I said, Indonesia time. And we have a session then which is going to be looking at innovation and collaboration, so working together to deliver connectivity to the hardest to reach areas. So please do come back and join us for that. But in the meantime, thank you again to Scott and to all of our panelists. And please do now make your way over to the showcase sessions, which will be starting very shortly. And then we will see you back here, as I said, at 7:30 on the main stage for the next plenary session. Thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you shortly.